Okay. We welcome everyone to the workshop series, Think Water, Act Now. These workshops take place on the third Thursday of every month at 6:30 p.m. and a link will be put in the chat for that you can access. Also, past recordings and presenter slides are available on the MRGWA website, and there'll be a link in the chat for this also, I think. Sorry about that. And we want to thank our sponsors, 360 New Mexico and New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light. The workshop series began last year to bring attention to the 2022 New Mexico Water Policy and Infrastructure Task Force recommendation to elevate regional water planning in the face of increasing water scarcity to promote equity and build capacity to govern and manage water. The Middle Rio Grande water advocates designed these workshops to bring state water officials and water experts together with water advocates and community members in the Middle Rio Grande and throughout the state for meaningful dialogue, supporting collective action to bring about transformative water governance changes in New Mexico that our hotter and drier climate change future requires. The workshop this evening, a Sequia and small irrigator perspective on centering equity in water planning, is the fifth in a series of 10 workshops held the third Thursday of every month. And I've already mentioned that the recordings and slides from the previous workshops are posted at the MRGWA website. And our panelists tonight are Jorge Garcia, the Executive Director of the Center for Social Sustainable Systems, CESOS, and Marcia Fernandez, MRGWA board member, CESOS board member, as South Valley Neighborhoods Association board's member, and South Valley farmer, and water advocates president Norm Gom will facilitate the discussion. So I think I'll take over from here, Norm.
Real quick, I would like Paula to introduce herself as well. I believe she is our other panelist tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Paula Garcia, and I live in Moran, New Mexico, and I'm the Executive Director of the New Mexico Acequia Association, which advocates for acequias, protecting our water for future generations and for agriculture. And I'm also an Interstate Stream Commissioner. Thank you.
And we are delighted to have the panelists this evening. I'm Norm Gom, President of the Water Advocates, and I'd ask you, if you're interested, please join our efforts toward water sustainability in the Middle Rio Grande in New Mexico. So the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates designed this workshop and speaker series to inform interested parties about the water planning legislation that passed unanimously in the 2023 session of the legislature this year. It was a real coup to get a unanimous passage by the legislature. That doesn't happen often. Our first monthly speakers explained this landmark legislation, and you can visit our website to view the video recordings and slides of those earlier presentations. This upcoming workshops, we'll get to this one in a moment. And Brittany, could you show that next workshop slide? Upcoming workshops will feature critical discussions regarding key aspects of water planning for resilience and sustainability in the Middle Rio Grande. On September 21st, we're going to hear from State Engineer Mike Hammond and General Counsel for the Office of the State Engineer, Nat Chikaris. On October 19th, we will hear from two Bernalillo County commissioners, Barbara Baca, who's also on the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District Board, and Eric Olivas, who is chair of the board of the Albuquerque-Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority. They will be speaking about the public interest in Middle Rio Grande water management, and that is directly related to the equity topic that we will discuss tonight. And I believe Brittany is going to drop links for those two workshops into the chat. Concern about and attention to New Mexico's water crisis is growing. The water advocates are working with partners towards a big kickoff event next spring to stand up the Middle Rio Grande Regional Water Planning Resilience Entity that's authorized by the new legislation. Additionally, we're working with partners to initiate a Middle Rio Grande water data work group to identify the data our planning entity will need as the foundation for its work. We must transformatively change to obtain sustainable resilience for our communities, regions, and our state. Transformative change in water governance must be grounded in the best available facts and science that incorporate traditional wisdom and community knowledge. We must collaborate to provide for the public health and for justice, equity, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion. The end goal is climate change sustainability with respect to having the water required to meet our needs. I'll close with a few words explaining how the future entity, the Middle Rio Grande Water Resilience Planning Entity, will consider equity as it prepares the Middle Rio Grande Regional Water Plan. The bill that passed last year, as introduced, required consideration of equity and non-economic environmental values. A floor amendment at the last step of the legislative approval substituted the concept of public welfare, a legal concept in state law that means the overall good of the state and its people. It's never been defined. The amendment requires each regional water planning entity to collaboratively define the public welfare of its region and to consider that public welfare in its planning. And the planning entity must also consider the water needs of future generations of New Mexicans. Equity must be a core value and is an essential objective. Our governor elevated equity as a key pillar of water governance. The water advocates' overarching goal is equitable adaptation to our diminishing water supply. We all need to amplify and extend the conversation tonight so the overall conversation is accessible and inclusive. I'm particularly grateful that Paula Garcia is here tonight. She has been incredibly busy leading her community's recovery from the devastating northern New Mexico fires that wiped out acequias and forests and streams and everything in northern New Mexico. It was truly devastating. And Paula is at the top of the community leaders who are doing their best to help with that recovery. And I would like to ask for just a moment of silence to think about those historic communities, some of whom have been in place for 400 years, who have lost the place that they call home due to forest fires associated with climate change. Thank you for joining us tonight, and please come back. Let me know if you are interested in volunteering with us. Thank you. I believe that Paula Garcia is going to be our first speaker, and I would like her to say a few words of introduction before she begins her presentation.
Thank you, Norm, and thank you. It's really great to see everybody. And Norm asked us to talk about what equity means to us, and I go back to our core value when we're talking about water. We say el agua es vida, water is life. And I think that equity is embedded or implied in that core value of water is life, because if you really believe that, you believe that your fellow human beings have a right to access to water, clean water for them to thrive, your fellow communities, and that we have water to grow food, clean water to grow food, and also that that our our fellow beings, our plants and wildlife, that we have healthy rivers and riparian ecosystems and watersheds that sustain life. So when we talk about agua es vida, I think that equity is considerate of all of that, but also that we elevate equity in consideration of the existing inequity that's in our society, that there's great wealth inequity, that there's injustice in the way that resources are allocated. And if there's one resource we have to get right, it has to be water. And that's so this is a really compelling topic, and I'm really glad that you're hosting this really important discussion. And thanks to the Middle Rio Grande water advocates and the other farmers and acequia leaders that are here tonight. Thank you.
I presume you're going to proceed with your presentation, Paula?
Sure. Okay, I'll get started with the presentation. And I'm sharing my slides right now, and let me know when you see them.
We see them.
Okay, good.
And you're going to go to slideshow?
Yes, does it look okay?
No, we're seeing the slides along the side. It looks fine, but it's not the slideshow format. There you go.
Is that better? Okay.
That's better.
Okay, so thank you again for the opportunity to visit with you tonight. It's a very beautiful evening here in Mora. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person, but I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to be talking about water equity from the perspective of rural communities, acequias, and small agriculture. When I feel like I have an innate sense of what water equity is, as I mentioned with Agua es Vida, but I Googled it out of curiosity, and the first thing that came up was this like equity stock exchange stock market thing, and I got really scared. I thought, oh no, that can't be what water equity is about. That's the antithesis of a value-based definition for equity. So I had to scroll down a little bit to find the Water Alliance. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the U.S. Water Alliance, they're a national organization that's advancing water equity as one of their pillars. And they have these three definitions: access to safe water for drinking and wastewater, sharing in the benefits of water, and are resilient in the face of disaster. And here in New Mexico, I think we're still defining that. And as many of you know, water equity, the concept of equity wasn't included in that legislation that passed, which we're all happy that it passed. But I think it's a sign that we have a ways to go in New Mexico to really have the concept of equity embraced in water policy circles. And I appreciate the Water Alliance and how they were defining equity, but I think for New Mexico, there's other deep considerations, including the intersection with justice and looking at the indigenous communities in New Mexico since time immemorial, and acknowledging that first as a really important intersection with and definition of water equity, as well as the small scale and centuries old acequia uses of water, which are very intertwined with place and culture. Rural community water systems, the small mutual domestics that really have a lot of challenges with maintaining their infrastructure and having access to water rights as well. And our collective water commons, our watersheds, riparian areas, aquifers. And so I could go on and on with these different dimensions, but I'll just go through them quickly. Surface and water, groundwater connection, climate resiliency. But I really want to emphasize this idea of intergenerational equity, that we consider future generations when we're discussing equity as a concept. And also that as Nora mentioned, we haven't, as a state, as a matter of public policy, haven't defined what we mean by public welfare. And to me, that's the most, it's a very important part of regional water planning for communities to have that opportunity to define what is public welfare. So just as important as looking at what should be considered in terms of water equity in New Mexico, I think it's helpful to think about what it's not. And there are economic and political forces in New Mexico that run counter to equity or pose a challenge to equity. First and foremost, I think the commodification of water, which emphasizes economic value over other values, including the core value that water is life. There's profound and tremendous political demands to transfer and lease water quickly. And the refrain that water flows uphill to money is something that runs counter to this idea of equity, because if we let water to be determined just by who has money, we're just going to exacerbate already existing inequities in our society. Another one is lack of resources in low-income communities to defend their water. So there may very well be protections in our laws. It's enshrined in our laws that existing water rights should be protected, but it's the onus is on those communities to have to protect their water rights by filing protests, by mobilizing in terms of their local governance to defend their water. So that's a real issue with water equity. And then there's economic implications of surface versus groundwater pumping, and equity implications of that. So I'll be sharing a little bit about surface versus groundwater. Just as context, what are acequias, just how many there are, hundreds across the state, and many tens of thousands of acres. I'm sure it's over 100,000 acres and tens of thousands of families. These are small and they're traditional, and there is evidence that earthen ditches contribute to aquifer recharge. And you may have seen in the New York Times that in Spain, they're opening up old acequias that haven't flowed for a long time as a climate change adaptation to slow the water down in aquifers and give it a chance to soak in, to make I guess you'd call it make a deposit on their savings account, in their groundwater aquifers. So they're very important for our future. And also, by way of context, we all know what's happening with climate change, and that acequia testimonials have affirmed these predictions, and also we're living in it. It's not something of the future. We're in the climate crisis right now, as evidenced by the mega fires that happened in 2022 with almost 1 million acres that burned, including in my home. And so I won't talk about that because it's going to take over the meeting, but I do feel like we're living in the apocalypse over here with the fire and floods. So first, setting that aside, just want to talk a little bit about water sharing, the importance of water sharing traditions in communities. And we have a very long history of repartimiento in New Mexico, and that it's a deeply cultural and voluntary way to manage water. And it can be accommodated in our modern water policy framework, but it's important that there be equitable resources for participation in those kind of agreements. And I think that the core of what's happening with our water is ultimately that there's less water for growing demands, and climate change is making this much worse. And we have to look at things in terms of the water commons that we all depend on for our survival. What we see is that there's going to be reduced snowpack, reduced stream flows, and increased demand, which is going to lead to aquifer depletion. And we're already seeing this right now. As our collective problem, it's something that we have to work on together as communities, and have really good data sets to understand how much water is in our aquifers, and to predict and manage increasingly variable surface water supplies because of the way climate change has affected our river flows. We need good regulation, well-resourced agencies to manage our water quantity and quality, and protection of existing water rights as an equity issue, because that's a principle, again, enshrined in our laws And because of economic forces, there is a trend of skipping due process protections for economic expediency. And there's a really profound implications of that. Commodification, the current problem of with water transfers, we need to ensure that they're not fast-tracked to the detriment of existing water rights, such as what has been happening with the practice of preliminary approval with water leases in the state engineer's office. The agencies in general, but certainly the state engineer's office needs good, stronger capacity for resources to evaluate water transfers and make sure we're evaluating impairment carefully and looking at public welfare and following the laws that we have. Acequias do have an ability to approve or deny water transfers. That's a good reform from the 21st century, but much more is needed. And also there's a strong need for very robust conjunctive management. So what would be a disaster is that over time, all of our surface, or most, or a significant number of our surface water rights get transferred to groundwater, and we'll take an over-appropriated surface water supply and over-appropriate the groundwater and deplete our aquifers. And that's gonna be detrimental to everyone. I think I'm running short on time, so I'm not sure if I could get into my scenarios. But to illustrate the way that there's equity issues with surface water and groundwater, I look at the scenario of Middle Rio Grande, where farmers are curtailed, having to start late or end their season early. And meanwhile, there's new farmers coming on the scene, whether they may be cannabis. And I don't really consider that farming per se. They're using mostly municipal water or groundwater to grow this plant, cannabis. And so the inequity is that you have surface water users that get curtailed, while at the same time that groundwater use is expanding for cannabis production. Another scenario that I think illustrates this inequity is Rio Rancho, for example, has a permit that requires them to get water rights from the Jemez Basin. Meanwhile, in the Jemez Basin, ancient pueblos and acequias are having to come up with water sharing agreements for surface water, and yet Rio Rancho can just go buy them and then pump, and doesn't have to share, doesn't have to be part of the complicated process of dealing with a scarce resource. Because once you have your well, and you pump it, you can pump, and you're not so concerned with your neighbors once it gets approved. So I think that dynamic is something we need to be watching really closely in New Mexico. So the problem with groundwater is in use in times of drought is how surface can be curtailed, but groundwater keeps pumping. And we need a very rigorous conjunctive management that carefully manages groundwater during times of drought. It is our savings account, but at the same time, we don't have a good accounting of what's in there. We need good regulations. AWRM, Active Water Resource Management, is a framework that's already at the state level, and each basin is supposed to be getting its own district-specific or basin-specific regulations, and that's an opportunity for local communities to shape how administration will take place there. And this is also where regional water planning is important. And one, we need to use it to define public welfare, but also in a very adapted and place-based manner, trying to set out what those values are and what those management protocols and policies are going to be for the future of our communities. So those are some of the highlights that I wanted to share with you. And thank you for listening. And I look forward to hearing the other speakers.
Well, that's definitely a hard act to follow, Paula. Absolutely everything that I could ever think about equity you have just presented to us. That was brilliant. So now I'm going to follow with my little statement that I wrote for our news, the Water Advocates online newsletter. Norm asked me to write something, and I quickly did, one day when I was really angry about water and lack of water inequity. So I wrote, equity is both a goal and a strategy, using the principles of equity to set up a process, for example, water planning in a time of water scarcity, such as what we've got right now in Mexico. It can result in a more equitable distribution of resources, such as water here in our drought-stricken New Mexico. So how do we get to an equitable water future? In my mind, it starts with listening to the community. That would be us, water users. People know what they want, and people know what they need. And this is where the planning process comes into play. Water planning can help communities distinguish between these two things, so we can figure out a way for everyone to share equitably in the abundance or scarcity of water. People, animals, plants, and the river itself depend on it, because agua es vida, water is life. Without an equitable water plan, something or someone will suffer or cease to be. And wouldn't that be a tragedy when we have a chance to do better right now with our water planning process? I was thinking about, Norm asked me to think about equity. Well, we've been talking a long time about equity. In my thinking, I did the exact same thing Paula did. I Googled it and found the financial things showed up first, and I moved on from there, thankfully. And after reading until I literally gave myself a headache reading online about equity, I sat and thought about things in the past and how they get defined. And it reminded me of I'm old enough to remember the struggles back in the 1960s, shall we say, with the laws that governed pornography. And the courts and the people tried to define it. And I just remember somewhere in the back of my memory that it's a very difficult thing to define, but you know it when you see it. And that's what made me think that equity fits kind of in that same slot. I may not be able to come up with 100 good words or sentences or graphs or whatever to show equity, but I think all of us recognize it or lack of it when we see it. Paula's comments about groundwater versus surface water particularly hit home for me. I'm a member of the South Valley Regional of Acequias. My husband and I both do. We live on a small farm in the South Valley and we irrigate. And so yesterday or two days ago, I called our ditch rider. They have a new name I can't remember, but to say that it has been 2 weeks since we watered, can we have water? And he said no. The water is going on by you. All of it has to go by you for a big delivery south of you. And I knew that was the big alfalfa farm, 300 plus acres south of us. And we have a little tiny farm. We irrigate 5 acres, very little. But I knew that we were being told that we couldn't have the water so it could pass on down. And the conversation continued, and my ditch rider told me, he said, the Conservancy District just changed the rules. We've had a lot of water up till now. Now we don't, and they now are putting you all on 3-week rotations. So heretofore, this season has been really good for us. The spring was wonderful. We had water every 2 weeks, and now he told me it will be 3 weeks, which is a challenge. I mean, when you start the season one way and then the rug gets pulled out from underneath you, you don't have your water. Well, somebody's still getting water. It just isn't the farmers in the Mid-Valley right now, or at least it isn't the small farmers. I'm not trying to accuse anybody of gaming the system, but there are people bringing in large crops of alfalfa when my pasture is effectively dead. We've had water on it just to keep the ground covered with something, which is weeds and wild grass, not pasture, nothing that's, not my cows are not interested in eating it. But those are the kinds of things that happen to the small guys, the little guys. We have felt that there's an inequity in the distribution of the water within the Conservancy District. That's a frustration for all of us who use that water. The pump changing from from surface water to groundwater, now you don't have to rely on, the river is going to go dry. It's happening again this year, folks. I'm pretty sure we'll be back down there, maybe having another ceremony this year to to cry for our river when she goes dry. People who do water transfers, our water goes out. Their water is not there. Our fields are dry. We are dusty. We are weedy. We are bad. But the people who convert it to wells will continue to pump, and they will bring in their crop of whatever it is they're growing on their field or in their greenhouse. And I'm not trying to demonize the cannabis industry, not by any means, but you know who they are. Again, you know it when you see it. So the inequities are many. There's no lack of things that are happening bad to the small water users in our valley. The thing that I also, we shouldn't always just think about people. I think we should think about the entirety of our mid-valley, which includes a beautiful riparian environment, includes the bosque, includes the green ribbon that runs through our state that people value so much. The aesthetics, the spirituality, the peace, the calm, the habitat for animals and birds and insects down there wouldn't be there if there were not farmers irrigating land and creating keeping the sponge that is our ground wet with the water that we irrigate that goes down and feeds these things. It keeps our valley green. We need to think about the animals and all of the system. And then lastly, we need to think about our river. This time last year, when the river was dry, it had been the first time in 40 years I'd seen it dry. I've seen it dry many times, but this was like a gut punch to see the river dry. We hurriedly put together a gathering of people who had a real deep connection to the river and felt genuine sadness. We gathered, and there was singing, and there was dancing, and there was chanting in a drum circle, and we mourned for the river. When we give water to the city, and we give water to the farmers, and we give water to everybody, we've given water to everything except the river from whence it all comes. And maybe that's our largest inequity of all.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes. My name is Jorge Garcia. I'm a director of the Center for Sustainable Systems. I'm also with the South Valley Regional Association of Acequias. I actually live and I'm a member of the Acequia de los Ranchos de Atrisco y Armijo. And so, thank you for inviting me to this dialogue, this conversation. Equity is a big issue here in the United States, and especially here in the state. Because when we talk about equity, there's this narrative that has been created over time about those who have water rights and those who don't. Right? So our system has become one of divide and conquer, right? And in between that, we have all these water uses, industrial for the most part, or industrial agriculture, that still continue to draw water, take water, even if it's not in the best interest of the populations that they're actually serving. Right? So equity is a big issue. And there are some questions that come along with the understanding of equity, in my view. One of them is when we think about pre-1907 water rights, small agricultural water rights, and we think about flooding, for example, flood irrigation, should we think about wasting water? The answer is clearly no, right? Because that flooding is actually providing waters to those who don't have water otherwise, right? Because much of the water is going to the aquifer. Yet, for the most part, flooding irrigation has been as the enemy of the people, number one, right? And so in this area of thinking about equity, there's a lot of lack of education that exists when it comes to really understanding water cycles and water distributions in the Middle Rio Grande. Right? For example, one of the issues that Marcia is bringing up is the fact that water distribution for small water users is gonna change, right? Is there anything that they can actually do or say about it? No, they can't, right? Why? Because that water is probably going out to either provide water to the compact or protect the species or to serve the interests of big farms, right? And so equity is a big issue, but I think that the other issue that sometimes we don't discuss, especially now that we're in this climate change that is affecting us right now, is the question of what kind of a society do we actually want? I mean, small agriculture is always depicted as the bad guy, but yet we only produce less than 5% of the food that we actually eat, right? And in places like the Middle Rio Grande, we continue building big boxes to create comfort for residents in the Middle Rio Grande, right? We're covering agricultural lands in the name of progress and equitable distribution of comfort for people down. And I don't know if that's necessarily what we need, but regardless of what I think, the question to me is that we're not really defining what kind of society do we want. Yes, we want planning. Yes, we should do planning. But in the meantime, politicians continue to make the decisions that they make. And the water systems continue to distribute and provide water permits like if there is no tomorrow. So Paula is right. We need better accountability, right? To be able to understand how water is actually being used, pumped, and distributed. But beyond that, I think we do have an existential problem, right? What kind of society do we actually seek? We always think about water for the future generations. That's a big responsibility. Are we actually serious about that? And if we are, what are the sacrifices that this society is actually willing to do to make or not to make, right? And it would seem to me that based on the political aesthetics that we have, meaning that policies will not necessarily change and political systems will not change, we're going to continue to compromise the future delivery for future generations. Because I doubt that we actually have an answer to what kind of society do we actually want, right? I mean, think about it, in a lot of the documents that we share regarding water distribution, water users, for example, one of the anomalies is that acequias are nowhere to be seen. Why? Because I think in the long run, it's going to be easier to forget about them and not even include them in any type of literature that is out there about discussing water, than actually, thinking of them as the systems that can actually solve much of the problems that this region is going to have. So yes, equity is a big problem, in a society that by nature is not necessarily equitable, and it hasn't been. So, I applaud the intent for us to decide or for us to work in the planning mechanism and planning discussions that can actually help us to understand. But I think that that for us to solve our problems, we really need to define what kind of a society do we actually want, and what are the sacrifices that we're willing to make, if any. The reality in our country is that political systems are, how do you say it, dreadlock? Deadlock?
Deadlock.
Yeah.
Not.
Why? Because there is so much corruption in a way. There is so much money invested, and politicians who are willing to override people's interests and well-being in the name of profits and future development that they perceive to be the reason why they're accepting things that don't make any sense. And we have plenty of examples of that. So it's good. I'm really glad, you know. But I think the more than planning at the highest levels, which is part of policy that is being proposed and that is changing, I think we should really, you know, have an understanding what the state and what the people actually want. How do we want to grow? How do we want to develop ourselves? No? And so there's a lot of questions and a lot of issues. In the meantime, you know, from the standpoint of acequias, like I said, it would seem to me that at least in the Middle Rio Grande, sometimes it would be easier to forget about them and ignore them altogether than to actually include them in the discussions and try to think about acequias not as something that not like a nuance.
An
But rather-
afterthought.
Exactly. Or rather something that can actually be very helpful to achieving some kind of a goal for the future generations. That would be equitable if we were able to come down to earth and perhaps take a step back and, you know, promote a society that is more simple and basic, and that it really truly believes that we should think global and act local, and that includes promoting small agriculture as the thing to go, you know. For a long time, Santiago, president of the South Valley Region Association, used to say that that the amount of water that is delivered to Intel is huge, right? It's a huge amount of water that plant takes. So what are we going to do when there is no water? Are we going to eat those chips or drink them? The answer is no, right? And yet we're investing on industries that we see it as profitable or appropriate for the progress of this region. So those are my comments on equity and equitable.
What questions do the panelists have for each other? And what issues would you like to discuss together? We have a limited amount of time for discussion, about 5 minutes, but the floor is yours collectively.
I need one sentence. I was so revved up by Paula's discussion that I just blasted into mine, didn't even say what my name is or anything. That's a pretty bad form. I must be very comfortable here. My name is Marcia Fernandez. My husband and I live on a small farm in the South Valley, in South Valley, Albuquerque. And I'm a retired teacher, and I'm not an expert, and I'm not an engineer, and I'm not a numbers person, but I do know how to grow, and I'm a mom, and more importantly, I'm a grandmother. And I think that we have taught our children and our grandchildren the values of growing, of producing food. We produce an enormous amount of food on our little piece of land for the whole family and friends and everybody. Anyway, just I think my perspective might be different than maybe all the experts that are going to actually help us solve these problems. But in my thinking, the most important thing is listening. You mentioned that too, that we need to listen to each other, and we need to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table.
Paula or Jorge?
I guess one question I have is specific to the Middle Rio Grande, and I'm wondering how some of the challenges around compact compliance are affecting you in the Middle Rio Grande. We're definitely seeing that in the Lower Rio Grande and some actions that are being taken there, but you know, it's been said that at some point these challenges are going to creep up to the Middle Rio Grande, and I'm just wondering, if I'm not an expert in how MRGCD operates or how acequias are dealt with within the district, but I'm kind of curious how you feel that it's been impacting you and both the district itself and within the district.
I think we have been, irrigators have been, well, we get told very little by the conservancy, by the way. If you want to find something out, you have to make a call or go to a meeting. They do not communicate with us at all, except the bill finds me every year in my mailbox very well. But we've been told that there are, when we don't have water, the water gets turned off, they don't tell us about it. We call for water and are told you can't have any. And this has been happening for basically the entirety of the drought, but it's gotten much worse. And we've been told that when we know that there is water stored up north and we can't have it, the answer has always been, that's for the compact compliance. I don't know, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not an expert on the water, but that's what we've been told, is that the water is being held back for compact compliance rather than being letting the farmers use it. So is that true? I don't know.
It is true.
It is. So that's one thing that's impacted us for sure.
You know, a few comments that I like to make about that though. When it comes to the Middle Rio Grande, and thinking about equity, well, I think that the Rio Grande has been suffering inequities since 1935, to be more exact. You know, one of I make the complaint that in most of the literature that there is out there, acequias are nowhere to be seen. Yet, under the Constitution of both the United States and New Mexico, acequias are a big part of the legal system, right? And it will seem to me that when we talk about, even within our own groups, when we talk about acequias, people, my sense is that people tend to dismiss them as, who cares about that? You know, I think that neighborhood associations are actually more important than acequias, and yet acequias are sub-political divisions of the state by law. Who respect that? Almost anybody, because the tendency is to forget about that. So the problem that the Middle Rio Grande has is, one, there's still suffering from the racism that came, you know, from 1848 on, and the need to disregard the populations that were functioning and producing food and producing their own way of life here. You know, all of that went down the drain from 1848. We were thrown into progressive agenda, a progressive economic system, and look where we are, at the brink of bankrupt. We are. You know, when we look at reports that are coming out in terms of the you know, how the climate change is going to affect in the years to come, we're in a total crisis, right? And it's beautiful that this community effort is being taken to bring into the conversation equity. But, and I'm going to say something, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but I always say it and I have to say it. The University of New Mexico, as much as the state of New Mexico, are racist institutions. We have to say it not so much to attack them, but to understand that unless we change our views and our way of understanding, we're not going to go anywhere, right? The differences that people create between those who might not necessarily have water rights and those who do, right? It's not just to bring equity, it's to put the two camps against each other. When in fact, one group is actually helping the other one. If we think about the cycles of water in the Middle Rio Grande, right? But there's so much ignorance, and we are tainted with prejudice ourselves, then it's easier to say, well, those people down there are wasting the water because they're flooding their. No, they're not. They're actually giving you 56%, according to the numbers thrown by RIB. 56% of the water that they're using per square foot is actually going into the aquifer. You know, so yes, we do have some issues, and mostly is the lack of understanding about the history of Atrisco, the history of what we call the South Valley, and the rights that it actually has, and the fact that it was a productive community prior to 1848, prior to 1945, 1935. It was a productive community. It produced all the food, and it could produce all the food. Why doesn't do it? Because there is no support for none of that. We rather give the water to the pecan farms and to alfalfa than actually, support small agriculture so we can actually produce food that we need.
But that's why these series of workshops that the water advocates have taken on is a huge undertaking in my view. My hat's off to you all. You've done a brilliant job. The conversation needed to be started. It needs to have everybody at the table. We need to talk to the urban water users, and as well as the industrial water users and the farmers and just the people, everybody that uses water needs to have a voice. And that includes, go back to my street here, includes the river, and it includes the silvery minnow, as much as I hate to say that. Everything that is connected to this water needs to have a seat at the table to begin to solve these problems. And it's not gonna happen unless the Asekas, which have been ignored, clearly, we're loud and we're making a lot of noise, and we'll have a seat at the table. We do have a seat at the table, but we need to make sure everybody has a seat at this table so that we can hear their ideas, their opinions, and we can begin to see through the situation through others' eyes. And that's the only way we're ever gonna come to an agreement of how everybody gets some of what they need, most of what they need, and some of what they want. We're not gonna get everything. This is going to be a compromise. Everything is compromise in life, isn't it, anyway? And I think the only way to work our way through that is to make sure that the equity in the situation is because everybody has a seat at the table, and their voices are heard and their opinions are respected.
So before we go to questions, answering questions from the audience, I'd like to make a little comment that's pertinent. The 2003 Water Security Planning Act puts the power of planning in the people. And the people have to come together. And they need to collaborate. That's the only way we're going to get to a plan that people agree on. People are going to have to understand that we have to live with less water. And we need to leave some for future generations, and we need to distribute the water we have equitably. Our goal is equitable adaptation to living with significantly less water. Well, the new law provides for that. Planning there's going to be state top-down rules that are going to provide structure for the planning, but the planning itself is bottoms up. It's the people coming together, understanding the situation, talking to each other, and getting to the point where they recognize that compromise is required and figuring out the details. And that's an incredibly tall order. But I think we're up to it. Regardless, we're going to try. In the Middle Valley, we, as I mentioned briefly before, the water advocates are working with partners to try to schedule a big kickoff event to create the regional water planning entity for the Middle Rio Grande. Now that will be a formal beginning of this process. And in the meantime, the state engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission are going to be issuing their guidelines. Paula, as a voting member of the Interstate Stream Commission, has a say in those. And we really look forward to seeing those rules. But while they are being done, we need to get to work to create our entity, because it will do, Jorge, I believe, it has the potential to do what you said we have to do. And with that, I think we need to go to questions from the audience. And let me see if I can get those up on my screen.
Okay, I'm going to call on people to ask the questions directly, and the panelists will answer. So we'll start with Martin Zer, who's asking, what is this? I'm sorry, Martin, you can ask your question.
No, I'm sorry, Janie, if you would please just ask the questions to the
okay.
panelists, and then they can answer.
Okay, Martin's asking, what is the state's public welfare system currently?
He says there is no state definition for public welfare of the state with regards to water. And that's an easy question to answer, so let me just take it really quickly. The requirement that the state engineer consider the public welfare of the state in every action that he takes to approve a water right transfer or application or everything was a result of El Paso trying to get water out into Mexico. And so the legislature put this public welfare clause into the law. It's mandatory for the state engineer to consider. It's never been defined, and it's been used by different state engineers in radically different ways. One recent state engineer said that beneficial use was the definition of the public welfare of the state, no matter who was using it. So in this planning effort, the regions will define the public welfare of the region. That will have to be done by consensus. And then the regional water planning entity must consider the public welfare of the region in conducting all of its work. The state engineer intends to take those regional statements of public welfare and combine them into a concise statement of the public welfare of the state.
And we better get to work, get that done.
We're doing that, but we're late in the game to be waking up to this collectively.
Okay, the next question is anyone trying to convince community leaders to control sprawl like in Rio Rancho or to stop the movement for increasing density in already established neighborhoods?
Can I take that one? I've been working for 10 years this month with a fine group of folks trying to stop an enormous sprawl development up on the west Mesa of Albuquerque. Santolina, some people have heard of it. I can't believe if you have not. 93,000 people will be housed there, give or take. It's 37,000 acres of land that they want to turn into a city that would become, I think, either the second or third largest city in the state if it is allowed to continue. So the Ponce Santolina working group, of which I'm a founding member, we've been for 10 years trying to show the county of Bernalillo that this is not in their best interest or in anybody's best interest. We started with water, and we've gone to transportation and just every other thing you could mention. And so far, we haven't defeated them, but so far in 10 years, they haven't broken ground yet for a single house. So yes, there are movements out there to stop sprawl. Sprawl is enormously bad for cities.
And to make the Santolina story worse, their plan is to get their water from the water authority. And the water authority has said the infrastructure for that water would cost a huge amount of money. And of course, they want the taxpayers to pay for that.
Actually, it's already set up where the taxpayers will pay for it. They have instituted 28 public tax, they're called TIDs and PIDs, tax increment development districts and public something or other districts, but it's all set up where, yes, it will cost them about $1 billion to get the water that they need for this huge development, and it will be paid for by ratepayers and taxpayers, and that's you and me and all of y'all, everybody.
Okay, we're gonna go on. We're going to go on to the next question. Why are New Mexican farmers still building out nut orchards that are highly, sorry, I've got to, that are, I can't see the question because the chat is covering it. Okay. Why are New Mexican farmers still building out nut orchards that are highly water intensive? Could there be an LT strategy to migrate to less water intensive crops?
Could there be a long-term
Strategy?
strategy to migrate to less water-intensive crops?
Probably, but they spent $1 bazillion planting those trees. They take many years to come to where they produce nuts, and I can't imagine a farmer who's put that kind of investment in the ground to rip them out and then begin to drip irrigate, kale. I don't see it happening.
That's a complicated question, no? Because in New Mexico, there are 3 major crops that take a lot of water, right? Chile, alfalfa, and pecans, right? And so that that's where the most that's where most of the water actually goes to, right? I think that the question that is being posed is a really good question in the sense of how do we actually want to use the little water that we have for industrial agriculture, or for sustainable farming that allows for us to grow the food that we need, not the pecans or even the alfalfa that probably goes out of state and is serving other people. I mean, let me just mention something that is in my mind really quick. It's really ridiculous the way that our society is actually, and the decisions that are made in our society. Look at what's happening in Arizona, and everybody knows about, or most people know about this, right? The Saudi Arabia is building, is growing alfalfa in Arizona because they don't allow for alfalfa to be grown in Saudi Arabia. And here we are in Arizona, one of the most arid states, and it's allowed. It's a shame. And that's what I'm saying. Yes, it's a shame that in 2023, the state doesn't have a public welfare statement.
If we have anything to say about it, water advocates are certainly we're gonna do it or we're gonna die trying.
No, I'm not, but I want us to think about what that actually means. 2023, we live in modern society. We live in a civilized society, and we don't have a public welfare statement. That's a shame. That's a shame because originally what happened is that the people that grow up in these areas and were sustainable, we came and what did we say? Bunch of savages. Let's destroy the world life because we're bringing modernity and civilization. And it just so happens that in 2023, we don't have a public welfare statement. That's a shame for our society.
Okay, thank you, Jorge. The next question.
He just answered that one.
What can we do to convince our legislators that the OSE and ISC need more money for staff?
Actually, I have 2 points that I like to, let me just say, 2 points that we should do. No, one is the politicians should actually have a direct effect on them, every decision that they actually make, that they actually suffer the consequences of whatever decisions they make.
That's radical.
They will stop them right away from doing and taking actions and decisions that go against the public welfare, right? And the other one is that I'm going to leave it on that one. Go ahead. No, but there is actually a direct result and consequences of the decisions.
I just had one thought about that. Our legislators, all of our elected leaders, starting from, city councils and county commissions on up, listen to when people write them letters, do the phone calls, writing the letters. People number one, everybody needs to get registered to vote and then actually exercise that right. That's the main thing right there. And then you need to contact your elected leaders or the people campaigning to be elected leaders. You need to let them know what's important to you. You need to let them know what you think is important for your children, your grandchildren, and all the way out for 7 generations, because that's how we need to think about land and water and air and resources and everything. We need to be planning for 7 generations. And you know what? We've got the power. Everybody who's watching this right now, you've got a computer, obviously, you're on a Zoom. You need to send letters to your elected leaders. I do it all the time. They're sick to death of me. You know, there are people who don't want to see my name on anything. But that's okay, because it's important to make that kind of noise. John Lewis, a big civil rights guy, said, you know, continue to make noise and continue to make good trouble. And what we need to do is make huge noise and big, big, good trouble in our state, or we're not going to get this task completed by being meek and polite. And I'll wait until the hearing comes up and I'll sit quietly and not say, no, we need to get up, we need to stand up. We need to stand up and say what we need, what we want, and that we are willing to volunteer and help. So get registered to vote, write letters, volunteer to help. That's how we get this done. I said earlier.
I don't think I can top that, but I do want to add that I agree that it takes mobilization and organizing and contacting legislators and being politically engaged to get legislators to respond. And I just want to mention that I think something Norm referred to earlier, which was the regional water planning bill, that got consensus support. I know, it was watered down a little bit, but what I've observed is that legislators do want to do something about water if they're presented with feasible solutions that they can actually enact. So I think water planning is sort of low-hanging fruit for that I think politicians can get behind. It does get harder when you start dealing with issues around water policy and how water is going to be managed in the state and where there's conflict. And that's where we really need to mobilize communities that care about water, people that care about future generations and protecting our water, because there's huge political pressure from industry at the legislature. And those of you who were involved with the water leasing bill, and well, it was the due process bill. It was to protect due process in water leasing. There was a lot of grassroots mobilization, but you get to the hearing room and there were about 100 lobbyists, in suits representing big money. And to counter that kind of influence is going to require massive grassroots organizing, coalition building around those fundamental principles about what we believe and letting our legislators know. And it's not a rural urban issue. This is our collective future that we're talking about. And, the other side is willing to pillage places if that's what it takes to make a profit. So I think it's, and it's complicated, if you'd be surprised who's on the side of industry. So we need to, do a lot of collective analysis, a lot of organizing and base building. And exactly like Marcia said, it's getting in some good trouble.
Okay, we have time for about one more question. Why hasn't the MRGCD implemented a sophisticated technologically based system to fairly distribute water, creating a schedule based on acreage of irrigation so that everyone gets the same amount per acre?
I have no idea.
Okay.
That's a good question, because if it's asking, if the question is why is it that they haven't developed more sophisticated systems to distribute the water, I don't know if there's a need. I mean, anybody can argue that there can be better systems, especially technologies. But as far as I'm concerned, the system that the MRGDC has provides for everybody getting an equitable delivery of water. Granted, the acequia systems and the irrigation systems are actually allow for that to happen, right, in terms of the infrastructure. Outside of that, yeah, they could probably develop more sophisticated ways, but I think that the acequia system, which actually provides for much of what the MRGDC does, was a system that was developed to be an equitable system for all the water users, and that's what they follow. So,
Well, plus the Conservancy District has an enormous amount of miles of canals to maintain, and the infrastructure is old and it's aging, it's falling apart, it's leaking, and so I don't know if this is a money problem or if this is well, I think they have plenty of money. Everybody's taxed for it, so I think there's money. Maybe money hasn't always flowed in the correct direction to keep the infrastructure up and running and current. They have made a lot of done a lot of modernization over the years. I wish they would make more of it known, especially to the irrigators themselves. Water is being metered, and I know that there are good folks who work for the Conservancy. We deal with very good people that the so-called ditch riders that we deal with mostly are really good. There have been some rotten apples over the years, but there are good people who are they're our neighbors, and they are doing the best that they can with what they have. And I think that our comments earlier about big agriculture and that sometimes somebody can come along and say, well, I deserve the water now more than those guys. I don't think that the Conservancy is complicit in that. I really don't want to believe that they're trying to make that happen, but I think, things can't always go, the water doesn't always flow smoothly. Sometimes it's choppy.
Okay, I'm going to move to the next question. Why hasn't the state or counties limited new domestic wells for areas served by municipal water?
Why hasn't the state or counties limited
new domestic wells for areas served by municipal water?
what do
I
you
have
think
no
about
idea.
that, Paula? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's no, the issue of domestic wells is interesting because it's one of just a very small number of ways that people can obtain a permit for water without having to transfer water rights in because of needing to have a water right. So you can get a domestic well without having a water right, and it's a permit. And there's different examples of the ways that those have been regulated. For example, like in the Emma settlement, there's no new domestic wells within the boundaries of that settlement. And there have been legislative efforts to try to add some more regulation to how domestic wells are permitted by the state engineer. But I'm not sure if maybe someone else knows if county or city government has the enabling legislation that allows them to stop wells from being drilled within their jurisdiction. Someone else might know that, but I know that there have been mutual domestics that have wanted to limit domestic wells within their service area, and I think that sanitation associations under the Sanitary Projects Act can limit domestic wells within their service boundaries. So I think it's a really good topic. I feel like I knew the answer one time, and I haven't dealt with the topic in so long, so I don't know the answer. But it's really important to get a handle. And if you look at the AMA settlement, that was one of the biggest issues, was that as long as there's domestic wells just being given out like candy, it was gonna impair Pueblo water rights, and it was gonna impair Acequia water rights. So that was the rationale for putting a stop to those. Now you have to remember that on the flip side, that also means that anytime someone wants a well, they're going to have to buy and transfer water rights into that well. So for the acequias, it's like a bitter pill. It's like it's the other side of the same coin. You either get it pumped from under you without your input, or you can get it transferred from above, and you might have some decision making over whether that's going to happen. But I think it just illustrates the real dilemma. And domestic wells are for domestic water. It's just like people's fundamental need for drinking water. So the public policy rationale for those is that people should have access to water. But I think the question about limiting them within local government jurisdictions is a really good question, and I think we should get back to that, because I don't know the answer, but I think sanitary projects systems can limit wells within their boundaries.
I think we have time for one or two more questions directly from the audience. If you have a question and you'd like to ask it yourself, please raise your hand. Brittany, can we see people who've raised their hands?
Yes, we should be able to see them. They would come to the forefront of the participants list.
Okay. Well, most of you have stuck with us for this whole webinar. I really want to thank our panelists for an interesting discussion. We've got our work cut out for us. I mean, I wish we'd started it long ago, but here we are, and now we're starting. We'll make the best of what we have. It's going to take good faith on everybody's part to make this work. And I know we'll have people who won't come in good faith, but we have to convince them that that is the only way we will solve living in New Mexico with less water caused by climate change. I'll turn it over to Janie for the closing.
Okay, I just want to remind everyone to do the survey that'll come up when you exit Zoom. It's really important to us that you do the survey, as your feedback is so helpful to us. And remember, it's not for MRGWA people. It's for the audience mainly. And I also want to give a short reminder of the upcoming workshops on September 21st and October 19th. We hope that you all will come back and participate in these. It's so important for the community to get involved in these discussions. And thank you to our panelists, Jorge, Paula, and Marcia. And I think that's all.
I think we'll say goodnight. Thank you for attending.
Muchas gracias.
The survey will pop up in your chat when you leave, so please fill it out. I'm not in your chat. It'll pop up on your screen when you close Zoom.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches. Thank you so much, panelists. We really appreciate your time and effort this evening. Norm, would you please save the chat before you close out?